Well, I am incredibly excited to welcome Dr. Augusto Grinspan to the SSI Executive Conversations podcast, the first chief medical officer that we've had on as a guest, and really excited about bringing more value to the marketplace around how this position is growing. Augusto is a global healthcare leader. He's always been committed to improving patient outcomes through developing the talent around him and on his teams for companies, and efficient implementation of the different innovative solutions that he's brought to the marketplace for companies. He received his medical degree from the National University of Cordoba in Argentina, where he also pursued specialty training in neurology. He sought additional neurology and epilepsy training at Louis Pasteur University in France. And then after several years of successful clinical practice, taking care of patients, he joined the pharmaceutical industry. He's worked for some really large companies like Merck, Teva, Novartis, and has mainly in that area focused in the CNS space during that time, mainly medical affairs and clinical development. But then he made the move over to medical device, joining Insight Tech as the chief medical officer in May 2023. He leads the medical affairs organization, focused on scientific communication, real world data generation, and the medical insights. Also clinical affairs oversight, which focused on designing and conducting insights, clinical development programs, and then also medical research interventions affairs. So focused there on providing support in treating and research facilities to ensure safe and effective treatments around the globe. So thank you so much for your time and your willingness to share your experience and your expertise with our audience.
Thanks to you, Darwin. Thank you for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, let's jump right in. So the first question I really thought that we could start with, you have such a wide range of unique experience and small and large molecules, therapeutics, medical device. So let's start about talking about that change from pharma to medtech. And I think from my decade, 12 years in corporate America, decade now, helping companies build teams and bring in talent that fits culture, I've seen so many scenarios where companies miss out on talent because they're trying to be so specific about certain things. And I think for some positions that is definitely a smart strategy relevant to risk management, but in other functional areas, maybe not. And so could you talk about that transition from pharma to medtech and maybe some of the challenges and then even if there were some surprises as well?
Yeah, happy to. In fact, the why that transition, I think that usually you may have people chasing positions that is perfectly fine, and I would not say that was not never my case either. But I was really always looking on chasing learning opportunities, things that I never done before. And certainly is an additional challenge because some employer will say, why I will give you this chance? You never did it. So, and how am I supposed to gain an experience and the knowledge if you don't give me the opportunity? But I felt that after almost 20 years in pharma, I have been done everything. I've been working on therapeutic area content. I've been working on people management. I've been working at global medical affairs. And then also I've been working more on regional, local managing teams across therapeutic areas. And I needed something new. And it really almost by chance. I've been following Insight Tech when they got the first approval of focus ultrasound for essential tremor. And then they got the second side approval because on essential tremor, you can treat one side at a time. So the first side was in 2016 and the second side was in November 2022. And was at that time, maybe December 2022, that I said, oh, wow, already 6 years in the first approval. So they may have a lot of real world data patients that have been actually treated with this technology. And I don't know if there are algorithms in the search or something, but it's crazy because in January a headhunter reached out to me for this particular role. And yes, it implied a kind of selling to the CEO and the rest of the executives on bring this pharma guy without experience, but in medtech. But at the same time, and now that I'm in, I realize it's not that different. It's still a treatment solution that you offer for patients in need suffering from a disease. It could be different maybe in other areas. Maybe I'm thinking orthopedics, but I think that the way the healthcare have moved, meaning that it's not enough any longer to get a drug or a device approved.
Hmm.
You need this drug or device or solution, let's call it, being reimbursed.
Right.
And in order to gain market access, you need to see that from a completely different, view, have a 360 view of what is the actual, life of that patient now with that treatment solution. And I think that this is common to pharma and medtech. So yes, for me, how it has been for me, I also think it depends from which pharma to which medtech, but let's call it according to my experience. I feel that yes, medtech is a little bit less regulated than pharma. And because of that, maybe in medtech you may get some outdated work practice, not up to date in pharma industry standards. Um, it is could be less natural, the cross-functional collaboration, and I've been working a lot on really making sure that we stop playing basketball and we play soccer, and I will tell you why. And you can see also that on lack of integrated planning that now in big pharmacies is part of the bread and butter.
So
But
it's
that was a challenge and surprise, but it's interesting.
it's interesting when it comes to oncology, for example. There is, from my experience in working on roles for scientific communication, clinical development, medical affairs, it has to be a very specific background. That, from my experience, there's usually not really an openness to look at cross-functional talent if they don't have that specific clinical area. And certainly, like in med tech, when you're talking about aortic valve or heart structure, a lot of those companies want very specific experience there. At the same time, in terms of risk management, it makes sense, right? The less they have, the person matches up with the skill set, then you open yourself up to risk. But depending on the size of the company, and you look at chief medical officer, there's so many different responsibilities. And I've talked to multiple chief medical officers about how, one company, the responsibilities or what they think the role should look like can be completely different than another company. And scenarios where a chief medical officer comes in, initially they're responsible for clinical development and management of the clinical trials, medical affairs, and then they're there 6 months and they want them to take on something they haven't done before. So I think in terms of what you talked about, I mean, you need people that are strategic thinkers, and the industry is with the age of the metaverse and in health tech. So robotic surgical platforms, wearable technologies, electronic medical records, all this, taking these large amounts of data and being able to actually use them to direct protocol development and deliver solutions. So, and now you got mobile applications. There's all these different things that the chief medical officer has to be responsible for. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves, because there's not really enough talent. There's a lot of people, there are people that have done it, and then there's this gap between those that want to do it. So I think it's really interesting kind of what you shared about that transition.
Hmm. No, this is absolutely true. I mean, at least it was from my experience, and what you mentioned regarding, wearables, electronic medical records, this is in my opinion, what gives you, when I was referring having a 360 view of that patient living with the condition, because the patient, after a clinical trial or after a physician prescribed a drug, goes in their life. So the patient spend much more time not in front of the physician assessing what the patient is doing or what the patient is telling, and that is where it can all these other tools with which we can actually assess and measure the impact of a treatment solution on a patient, and those are key to integrate. Key.
So I was going to ask you, the next question that I wanted to ask you was kind of what advice you would give. But you said, meeting with the executives, like you kind of had to sell yourself a little bit. And one of the things you said earlier that I know for me, my last 3 positions in corporate America, maybe 4, I'd never done before. I got an opportunity, and based on most people looking from the outside in would deem it successful. I'd never owned a business before, and 10 years later, it's done fairly well. Never done podcasts or any webinars before, but there has to be something in it for them. And I think sometimes looking at the right talent, I think it's vitally important that the personal why matches the mission and vision, so that it matches the culture. Because if you get that, and then they're problem solvers, high emotional intelligence, you're going to have higher employee engagement. People are going to come together to problem solve more effectively. And if there may be a 7 or 8 out of 10 in terms of checking off every box, but they have the crossover skills and the passion, you can get somebody that's an 11 out of 10. And if they don't really are passionate about being there, and they don't have the right emotional intelligence, problem solving like people, then it is not going to work out. So maybe share how you approached it in that interview process, and what would you share with talent that sees this, that are medical directors, that are, medical affairs managers, or they want to move up, or they're a chief medical officer that would like you said, you want to do something different. You want to learn and bring value to move over to pharma or move over to a biotech or a med tech area. What would you?
What I would say is go for it. It's a great learning opportunity. Now it will vary enormously from company to company. And I don't think that we can say pharma is like this, medtech is like this. Yes, I mentioned, I had the impression that medtech is a little bit less regulated than pharma. But again, it depends also on the companies, and it depends on the size of the company. You say yourself, you created your company, and you can be the VP, CEO, but you're the one mapping the floors and answering the phone because you're employee number 1, right? So in a small company, you can be the CMO, but there will be a lot of things that you will do yourself. And this is what I see and moving from large companies. I did move now from Merck KJA or EMD Serum in the US, the oldest pharmaceutical industry in the world, more than 350 years of existence, to a pre-IPO medtech company, 400 employees. Of course, it was a big gap, but the learning is really enormous. Is what really drives me or keeps me going. So, first advice, go for it. Second advice is really understand the disease state and understand the patient journey to see how from the CMO office we can help the business. I'm always saying to my teams, in any position that I have, I've been always working, except a short period in sales. I was working either in medical affairs or clinical development, but I always said, we do science for sure, but we do science for business. We don't do science for science.
Right.
You know, it's how this can be translated into
It's not,
business.
it's not academia, right? So you have,
Yeah,
that's one of the things that from my experience, and I've worked on scientific business development positions because they haven't had success bringing on somebody that didn't have that specificity of the educational experience, different complexity, but there's sometimes been challenges with talent coming out of academia and understanding the sense of urgency because you don't have the time. You have to bring value, you have to, and then sometimes understanding what positions are going to make sense because they've got a doctor, a PhD, MD, and it's like, hey, I want to be a VP or I want to be this. And sometimes you don't get a start at that area, that level coming over from academia. So I think
yeah,
really,
yeah. No, absolutely. So and that's why I understand the whole disease state. I understand how you from the science you can back up the business and and yes, and take the time to understand the culture of the organization you are in and from where people are coming from because you it's natural to see cultural resistance within the organization. It's important to understand, if you have medical science liaison teams, the more you have more prominent field roles, the line between those operations and the sales reps will inevitably come into question from regulators. So you need to make sure that you the medical team follow a certain compliance patterns, and also use the tools that you have at your disposal. I am coming from big pharma that we have all the tools possible available to a medtech that we don't. And
right.
okay, we need to say, okay, it's not the tool, but what I what I wanted to get from those tools and try to get the teams to report on those particular metrics. Okay, without tools, but at least you can judge or assess the direction of the organization and how the impact of your organization oh yeah is how is impacting the business.
Mhm.
For your commercial counterpart, you need to be able to speak in a language that they do understand. If you speak your scientific language, they may get lost and they don't know what you do. So they are more into metrics, talk, numerical targets, numerical metrics
Mhm.
for them on what we have achieved. So it helped them to really see that. And then, it will start seeing the rest on the quality metrics.
I think that's super smart what you said and why the chief medical officer position's grown by 19% since 2000. And the pandemic has shown areas where the need for some of that direction relevant to risk management oversight is vitally important. So it's going to be interesting. And of the 150 largest health tech companies, I think it's like 30% of those chief medical officers, it's their first time position. So
Mm.
where does talent come from? But what you just said relevant to the commercial piece, and I was in corporate America for 12 years before this, all in commercial roles, and so that if you don't understand somebody else's challenges, then the ability to reach across the desk in the different functional departments and create collaboration and understanding what other people's pain points are. And for the chief medical officer, there's so many different areas that the more that person understands and they bring people together, because silos are never a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Anytime
Mhm.
you have silos, that's typically where you get misalignment, which leads to wasted resources and fines and issues like that. And in medtech alone, the average warning letter over $1 million per company, $6 billion annually. So that communication leading to collaboration and employee engagement is vitally important, not just for risk management, but it ultimately benefits every stakeholder in terms of the financial success of the company.
Absolutely, because at the end, if you don't have a viable company, you can have a amazing product
Mm-hmm.
where you can transform the life of millions of patients. But if you don't have a viable company, a viable business plan, you know, everything goes south and nobody will benefit from that.
Right.
And that's why I said to them, you need to understand what is the business goals, where we are, and what is the competitive environment. So it's not that, oh, I'm do science, I don't care the numbers, I don't know what we were supposed to do, this is up to sales. Yeah, it's up to sales to execute, maybe on sales, but you need to know what is the direction that we're going.
Right.
You need to know what is the direction for the organization, and you need to be able to translate on how what you do is helping that aspect as well. So yeah, to me this is key. Certainly, as you mentioned, there are in many companies, new companies now, the CMO role could be the first role of a person. I I'm very happy to be able to use my experience and not being this one the first job because I don't know what I would have done. When you have worked in clinical development and you said, okay, how I can measure the impact of this treatment solution on patients and how and having the discussion with payers, just try to understand what is meaningful for them. Um, and by running those clinical studies, also you need to report on safety, and you have that idea of safety officer, pharmacovigilance that usually are also under the scope of the CMO. And by to execute those studies and getting those endpoints, okay, by regulators, you need to have those interactions with regulators.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so glad that I had that experience because I don't know what I would have done moving from clinical practice to the role without that knowledge. It could be a stretch. Yeah.
So a couple of different things that you said there. First of all, and you've mentioned reimbursement a couple different times, as well as the commercial team. And I a part of the LSX MedTech global ecosystem. I got an opportunity to present there last September, and I'm leading a CEO panel in London in April. But for LSX and LSI, emerging medtech as well, you've got all these leaders looking for money to raise capital for ABC funding. LSX, all of their investors have told them the three main things that determine whether or not they're going to give a company, even consider giving a company millions of dollars for their product. Number one, they have to have a strong understanding and strategic plan for the regulatory quality pathway relevant to getting to market, risk management. They have to have a strong understanding of the reimbursement strategy, and then they obviously have to have a commercial launch strategy. And if they don't have all three of those down and can communicate those really well, then they're not even interested in spending time with them. So I think it was very interesting that you pointed that out. And then in terms of from a sales standpoint, first of all, nobody wants to be sold anything. And when I was a part of Philips Respironics and we brought the Trilogy ventilator over to the United States, everybody in that position that was a point person on getting that into the market, you had to have a lot of ventilation experience and be a respiratory therapist to get in that role. And like selling, the idea of selling, which to me, it's all about sharing, understanding people's challenges, problems, what's the issue, and then you share the right solutions. Mm-hmm. So helping your commercial team understand what matters to the physician, the clinician, the patient, and then communicating in the correct fashion, right, relevant to risk management around that medical affairs, the communication piece is really important. Let's segue into, the next question. Kind of one of my friends who's going to be coming on, he was actually the first person I ever interacted with almost 3 years ago when we started Top Time Accelerant, and we started to do interviews of the hiring manager to share candidates. He was the first person I ever did it with. And we were talking about the chief medical officer role last month, and about how, from an executive standpoint, sometimes they're really not sure what that scope looks like. So what has been your experience? Maybe you could please speak to that, relevant to the different, your ascension through pharma in your career growth, the different areas that you were over, and then what it's looked like at Insight Tech in terms of responsibilities.
Yeah, look, okay. So the areas that I've been at in pharma, and the ones that I'm now at Insight Tech, you asked me?
Yes.
Okay.
Kind of speaking about the variance of the scope from maybe
Yes.
one company to another. I've had that conversation multiple times, so maybe you could just speak to your experience.
Yes, absolutely. In pharma, I started. My first role was really the no, the basic, the bread and butter of medical affairs in epilepsy. As an epileptologist, as you mentioned in the introduction, thank you, I'm being trained in France. So that there, going back to France and joining Johnson and Johnson with a product in epilepsy, a product that I've been part of the investigators before in clinical studies on that particular product. That is how I got it into pharma. And usually, always, on all my pharma roles, then in different companies, different geographies, was always on how to better educate on the product, better communicate on the product, getting publications out, getting Congress coverage strategy, any eventually data generation efforts that were needed, was always in medical affairs, all around that space. Then I moved into sales, that I thought was crazy. When my mentor said that I needed to have that experience, because he said that was the best school, management school that I could have. Manage a group of sales reps. I did manage a group of sales reps to do a launch of a new product in psychiatry. So I moved from neurology to psychiatry. And then the other scope was in clinical development. And I think that there is where I learned really the nitty gritty on the clinical trial design. And it was there that I needed to interact with regulators, with payers. And then I realized more on the need on the voice of the patient. And in my latest positions in other pharma companies is how we can integrate that voice of the patient and approaching, government affairs and patient associations to validate certain tools that we wanted to use for clinical studies or endpoints that we wanted to do. So these were kind of the scope and responsibility that I was having. And kind of that was my selling pitch, if you want, for the CEO at Insight Tech, that I was saying, hey, what I'm offering you, yes, I'm a neurologist. This is the treatment in the neurology space. But what I'm offering you is that ability of not looking at the patient, but at the person living with the condition and the impact that disease condition has on that patient, and how to bring the proper players to the table. Because for Insight Tech, the system, the equipment is MR guided focus ultrasound. I don't know if you have seen, there are plenty of videos in YouTube. Is incredible. It's amazing. Is neurosurgery without cutting the skin.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's a treatment solution that you can really turn on or turn off, if you want, the tremor of a patient with essential tremor or Parkinson's disease. So, but the thing is, the systems are in the hands of the neurosurgeons or the hospital, but the patients are being followed usually on essential tremor by neurologists or primary care physicians.
Yeah.
How do you make sure that those guys are aware not only about the technology, but properly, assess those essential tremor patients and properly refer the patients to the right place. So that is what I was kind of offering, that I was able to help. And yes, I have shifted the focus of the medical team that before were a small team, but before they were working more on a reactive way. Dr. So and so wants to talk about this, Dr. So and so is asking that, but on never having a plan on how to approach education,
Mm,
how to approach scientific communication, what Congress would this to be, why we are a neurosurgery Congress when neurologists and primary care physicians are the ones that are seeing the patient,
mhm.
how we shift towards that. And any data is valuable data. That was the other thing. You know, I think that we have increased the number of publications by the factor of 5 or 6 since I joined,
Wow.
because you have post-marketing surveillance data.
Mhm.
When I saw that, I said, okay, where this was published? Oh, you think this can be published? Of course, this should be published. And why is that? And now we are present in neurology meetings, the American Academy of Neurology, the European Academy of Neurology. We do anchor posters, and this, I think, it helped me get into the role, but was something that the whole organization have appreciated very much. And the medical team is, shining and thriving, are really happy with what they're doing because they see the impact that they have.